Hi again. I hope this lecture finds you well as always and everything's going well for you. So in the last lecture I was talking about how we communicate our work as youth workers, how we communicate our practice, and how we explain to people what we actually do beyond the cooking and the games and the football. And we were looking at what Davies talks about, how do we define ourselves? So do we define ourselves in relation to another profession, or do we define ourselves as something else in particular, maybe something like a social educator? So some of those ideas were addressed in the last session that I had with you. So moving on a little bit from that session, and this one is extends a little bit further from the last one that we had. And this one looks at, what it means to do professional youth work, particularly with that emphasis on the word professional. So as we've looked at throughout history, youth work has been something there within charitable organisations, within philanthropic organisations, within those spaces since the 1800s, whether we're talking about Greece, whether we were talking about Ireland, or whether we're talking about Britain. It's been there. Whether it was identified as something as called youth work is debatable, but in recent times we've seen that we have been able to define it more so through practices, through values. We've identified those practices, those values, those principles that underline youth work, and now we have quite a strong reference point in order to be able to explain what we do and how we do it, at least amongst ourselves. Doing that still with people outside youth work is still very much a challenge. So today, like I said, we're going to focus on the actual word professional within youth work, and what makes youth work. So we have youth work. We've to an extent discussed and gone through different ideas of what youth work is and what the practice of youth work is and the values. So then what makes youth work professional youth work, and how can we call youth work professional? So many of us doing this course, identify ourselves not just as youth workers but as professional youth workers, particularly the Irish youth workers. And how do you do that? Why do you do that? What makes you professional? So the first point of call is to look at the word professional, like I said. So like I said, the last lecture looked at communicating our work as youth workers and how we do this through stories and conversations. So in other words, how do we communicate and explain what we are doing in practice beyond the visual representation of what people see, such as the cooking or the playing games or the going to the cinema. So how do we explain what we're doing? Because all of them activities are there just to facilitate that process of self-development and self-esteem, and building those things with the young person and the young people that we're working with. So in this session today, we're looking at this session and the next half of it that I've recorded this. We're looking at not just practice and communication, but what does it mean to be a professional youth worker? So not just a youth worker, but what does it mean to be professional? What does it mean to be paid to actually do the work full time? This is really important, particularly when we're talking about being able to articulate ourselves and communicate our work to the outside, in particular. And I mentioned the last time, funders, so people who are giving us money and who are paying us wages to be youth workers. We need to be able to explain, well, what do we do? Not only because we need to explain why we're getting funded, why we're getting wages, but we also need to explain that how youth work actually and does, as we know, contribute to a young person's development, okay, in an informal and non-formal way. So we need to be able to explain that for ourselves to the outside so they understand, and very much so for the young person so they can identify the process that's going on. Maybe not immediately, but that they can identify what went on at least later on. So a youth worker who gets paid as opposed to, for example, a volunteer youth worker. So that's why it's really important to be able to identify what professional means. So what sort of things can we start looking at when we talk about profession? So what what's our starting point when we talk about profession and being a professional, okay? So some of the ways to start looking at this is firstly through the idea of profession. So there's a study within sociology called the sociology of the professions, where different sociologists, theorists have looked at the idea of profession and what makes a profession, and it's really interesting. It's that broad study of professions, obviously not just applied to youth work, but it gives an idea, it gives a number of ideas in regard to how we look at profession. So how do we define profession as a society, and how has it been defined over the years? Where did profession come from, and how has it evolved within different professions? So some people are automatically seen as professionals as soon as they graduate and they get their qualification, they're seen as professionals. So for example, solicitors, teachers, doctors, they're all seen as well-known professions, okay? Also, we can look at practice again, as we've done before. So how does looking at our practice and exploring practice and youth work practice help us define or explore the concept of profession? Also by looking at associations. So associations are something, again, down through the years that have been used to substantiate what profession means. So a professional association. So if people have ever heard of guilds, particular guilds associated, so workmen's guilds, you know, they're associations that are organised for a particular profession. So you'll often see that a psychologist is registered to a particular association, or you know, you have solicitors that are part of, you know, the Law Society of Ireland, or different associations that bring together people who practice under one particular profession. Okay, so associations are also another way of identifying and substantiating why something is seen and maintained as a profession within society. And then we have training, so which again goes back to the historical origins of profession. So training, such as your university training, what training is there for you to become qualified and justified in practicing the profession that you identify with, okay? And that's really important. So what does professionalism mean? So Devlin says professionalism is, relatively speaking, a static concept. In other words, it does not in itself encompass the notion of evolution or change. Now this quote has come from the article that I've put up on Moodle for you. So it's really important to please do read that article as well, because it'll make more sense. But I've just took a few quotes out of it just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. So professionalism refers to a way of thinking and acting in relation to the work to be done within any given occupational area, an approach to the role and tasks of the worker, and it usually implies a concern with such matters as standards, accountability and reliability. And some of that might sound familiar to youth workers who are practicing as professionals at the moment. So you know, this emphasis on accountability and reliability, and in particular standards. So like that, Devlin says professionalism is, relatively speaking, a static concept. So something that has already been formed within society, okay, professionalism. Professionalization, on the other hand, and just to be clear, so when we're talking about professional, we're talking about these various concepts within it. So professionalization has a more dynamic quality, Devlin says. So where professionalism is static and has been set out, professionalization, he says, is more dynamic. It refers to a process of change over time. So if you think of professionalization, how things are moving and changing, to the way in which significant aspects of an occupation develop and evolve, and it usually implies a concern with status, recognition and relationships with other occupations, okay? And again, this is very prevalent when you think of different occupations that have become professions, that have professionalized. How is youth work at the moment? And for those of us in an Irish context or a British context, I know the Greek context is still very much voluntary led, but how do we see youth work professionalized, and how is it becoming professional? How is it going through particular steps that is recognizing it as a profession? So the noun then, profession, and the verb to profess. So looking back at the origins of profession, to profess means to avow, acknowledge, or confess. And one important historical meaning, Devlin says, of the noun profession is therefore a solemn declaration, promise, or vow, such as that made by a person entering a religious order. So this is really interesting because profession and profess, like we say, has its origins back in the 1600s, which you'll see in the article that you read from Devlin. And this is really interesting. So it goes back to this idea of, to be a profession, you were professing to do something, you were making a vocation, you were making a promise to people within society that you were going to do something for the good of society, which is really interesting when we go back to this idea of profession, because when we look at professions now, there's such a variety of jobs that people do that we call professions, but the actual idea of profession and profess goes back to this idea of taking a vow, of making a promise to people, to society, okay? Which is interesting then when we think of youth work, because when we're talking about youth work, we talk about it as a vocation, as doing it for the good of society. It's not just a job to earn a wage and do your 9 to 5. It goes beyond that. As youth workers, we can confess to youth work going beyond that idea of just getting a wage. You'll often hear youth workers say, it's not just about the money I get, but obviously it's not, because especially with some of the conditions that have been there over the past few years with semi-permanent part-time contracts that have been there. So it goes beyond that. So this is interesting when we talk about the contemporary definition of profession. Devlin says is a vocation in which a professed knowledge of some department of learning or science is used in application to the affairs of others, or in the practice of an art founded upon it. So just keep that in mind when we're thinking about youth work. So this points to the concern of ethics, okay, and this ethical obligation within a profession to society and to people. So it's just for you to think about, is that what we're doing in youth work? And that would be my stance on it, is that we have this ethical obligation to young people, to society, to families that we work with. Therefore, can we align youth work? Is youth work more closely aligned to the original idea of profession and professions that Devlin speaks about, that was first there in the 1600s? So these original professions, that was the doctor, that was the teacher, that was the engineer, okay? So these original professions, okay? So looking at various ideas of profession. So over the years, as we've said, different ideas have evolved, okay, on what profession is. So others, sociologists such as Durkheim, have looked at professions in respect of their social function, their role in the economy, and the ways that professional status was able to leverage power, okay? So this is in CIRCOM, and the features of this are that they've looked at trying to find commonalities amongst people that have become professions and how they worked on the ground, okay? So some suggestions that a profession did some of the following: that professions restricted entry to people coming into them, so only certain people could enter particular professions, okay? So there might be because of particular background, particular training. They set out these standards that professions were seen to have inflated incomes, use collective power to promote their own interests, be less accountable, disempower clients by using particular language and jargon, and protect each other by closing ranks, okay? So these are some of them, and quite probably, as you see, quite critical, to an extent quite negative perceptions of what a profession was doing. Not to say that all of these aren't correct, but to an extent then there's also a negative stance that maybe some professions had done this, but again maybe other professions hadn't, okay? So Cohn looks at the idea of not listing the attributes as was done, but identifying the central core of a profession as an ethical commitment, and can be seen in the relationship, okay? And this can be seen in the relationship. So CIRCOM looks at the idea of profession from this professional perspective. So that professional makes a vow, a pledge, a commitment. There's a relationship that both buy into, and a profession is defined not by a set of practices, but instead by a relationship. And we look at this a little bit more closely in the second half of this session. Okay, so just keep in mind those ideas, those original ideas of where profession came from. And if you could just do the quiz just before you move on to that second half, that would be great. Thank you.